They didn't walk through something obvious. There were no visible scars, no dramatic scenes that outsiders could easily point to and say, that's where the damage began. What they endured was far more subtle and therefore far more destructive. It was a quiet, psychological war, one that unfolded behind closed doors, in carefully chosen words, in calculated silences, and in moments that seemed insignificant on the surface but carried immense weight beneath. At first, it didn't feel like abuse. It felt like confusion, like constantly second-guessing your own memory, your own emotions, your own sense of reality. One moment they were certain of what they felt, and the next they were being told that those feelings were wrong, exaggerated, or imagined. Over time, this creates a fracture within the psyche, a split between what is experienced and what is allowed to be believed. And this is where the real damage begins, because when a person loses trust in their own perception, they become vulnerable in a way that goes far beyond pain. They become programmable. They start adapting, shrinking, reshaping themselves, just to maintain some sense of stability. Not because they are weak, but because the mind, when pushed into chaos, will do anything to restore order, even if it means sacrificing truth. What makes this kind of war so dangerous is its invisibility. There are no witnesses to validate the experience, no clear moment to mark the beginning or the end. Just a slow erosion of certainty, of confidence, of self. And by the time they realize what has been happening, they are no longer standing on solid ground. They are standing on a version of reality that was constructed for them. So understand this. The deepest battles are not the ones fought in the open. They are the ones that rewrite who you are without you even realizing it. And after that silent war, something even more profound begins to unfold, something most people never anticipate. It is not just that they were hurt. It is that the person who entered that experience does not come out the same. In many ways, that version of them does not come out at all. What we are really witnessing here is the death of an identity, not in a dramatic cinematic sense, but in a slow, almost imperceptible dissolution. The qualities that once defined them, their openness, their willingness to trust, their instinct to see the good in others, begin to feel like liabilities rather than strengths. And so, unconsciously, they start to let those parts of themselves fade. This is not a conscious decision. It is a psychological adaptation. The mind, when confronted with repeated betrayal or distortion, begins to reorganize itself around survival rather than authenticity. It asks a different question now. Not who am I, but who do I need to become to avoid this pain again? And in answering that question, something essential is often lost. There is a concept in depth psychology that suggests we all carry a kind of internal structure, a sense of self that gives us coherence and direction. But under prolonged psychological pressure, that structure can fragment. The individual begins to feel disconnected not only from others, but from themselves. They may look the same, speak the same, even function in the world as before. But internally, there is a growing sense of unfamiliarity, as though they are observing their own life from a distance. And this is where the tragedy lies. Because what was once natural, trust, vulnerability, emotional presence, now feels foreign, even dangerous. The very traits that made them human begin to feel like weaknesses that must be suppressed. So understand this. When someone survives this kind of experience, they are not simply recovering from pain. They are rebuilding from absence. And the question they must face is not just how to heal, but whether they have the courage to rediscover the parts of themselves they were forced to abandon. And once that identity begins to dissolve, the psyche searches for a new equilibrium. It cannot remain in a constant state of vulnerability, constantly exposed to confusion and emotional injury. So it does something both remarkable and troubling. It shuts down what once made connection possible. This is where emotional detachment takes root, not as a preference, but as a defense. What was once empathy becomes restraint. What was once openness becomes caution. They begin to feel less, not because they are incapable of feeling, but because feeling has become associated with danger. The mind, in its attempt to protect itself, starts to filter experience through a different lens, one that prioritizes control over connection. You might notice this in subtle ways. Conversations become more analytical, less personal. Reactions become measured, almost calculated. There is a distance now, even in moments that once would have been intimate or emotionally charged. It is as if a part of them is always observing, always evaluating, never fully immersing. From a psychological perspective, this is not dysfunction, it is adaptation. The individual has learned that unguarded emotion can be used against them, that vulnerability can be exploited. And so, they construct an internal barrier, a boundary that is not always visible to others, but deeply felt within. It creates a sense of safety, but at the same time, it isolates. Because here is the paradox. The very mechanism that protects them also prevents them from experiencing genuine connection. They are no longer easily hurt, but they are also no longer easily moved. Life becomes quieter, more controlled, but also less vibrant. And over time, this detachment can become identity. They may begin to see themselves as someone who is naturally distant, naturally reserved, naturally unaffected. But beneath that surface, there is often a suppressed depth, a capacity for feeling that has simply been buried, not erased. So understand this. When someone becomes emotionally distant, it is not always a sign of coldness. It is often the residue of having felt too deeply for too long without safety. And the real challenge is not just learning how to feel again, but learning when it is safe to do so. And from that emotional detachment, another shift quietly takes hold, one that reshapes how they relate to every person who enters their life. Trust, which was once instinctive, becomes something unfamiliar, almost unnatural. It no longer flows freely. It must be examined, tested, and often withheld. You see, trust is not just about believing others. It is rooted in the ability to rely on one's own perception. And that is precisely what was compromised when someone has been repeatedly told that what they see, feel, or remember is wrong. They begin to doubt the very instrument through which trust is formed. So even when they encounter honesty, something within them hesitates, not because the other person is untrustworthy, but because their internal compass has been disrupted. This creates a constant state of vigilance. Every word is analyzed, every gesture interpreted, every inconsistency magnified. What once would have been taken at face value now becomes a puzzle to solve. They listen not just to what is said, but to what is implied, what is omitted, what might be hidden beneath the surface. It is an exhausting way to excise, but it feels necessary. And over time, this vigilance becomes habitual. They may not even realize they are doing it anymore. It becomes part of how they navigate the world, a quiet, ongoing assessment of risk. Relationships, as a result, begin to feel less like spaces of connection and more like environments to be managed carefully. But here lies the deeper issue. When trust is replaced by constant evaluation, intimacy cannot fully form, because intimacy requires a degree of surrender. a willingness to not know everything, to not control every outcome. And for someone who has learned that uncertainty can lead to harm, that surrender feels dangerous. So they stand at a distance, present but guarded, engaged but never fully exposed. And the question they must eventually confront is this: if you no longer trust easily, how do you rebuild a life that depends on connection? Because at some point, healing is not just about protecting yourself from deception. It is about relearning how to recognize truth without losing yourself in the process. And yet, within all of this, beneath the detachment, the vigilance, the loss of trust, something else begins to emerge. Something sharper, more precise. Almost as if the mind, having been pushed to its limits, has reconfigured itself into a more advanced form of awareness. Pain, when prolonged and deeply internalized, has a way of refining perception. They begin to notice patterns they once overlooked, subtle shifts in tone, inconsistencies in behavior, the unspoken tension behind certain words. These things no longer escape them. What used to be intuition becomes something closer to strategy. They are no longer simply reacting to the world, they are reading it. From a psychological standpoint, this is a form of adaptation that borders on transformation. The individual develops a heightened sensitivity to human behavior, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. They have learned, often the hard way, that what is hidden can be more important than what is visible. And so they train themselves consciously on not to look beneath the surface. But this sharpened awareness comes with a cost, because when you begin to see too much, it becomes difficult to return to a state of simplicity. Innocence, in the psychological sense, is not easily recovered. They may find it harder to take things at face value, harder to engage without analysis, harder to simply be without scanning for meaning or motive. And yet, there is a certain power in this evolution. They are less easily deceived, less likely to be drawn into illusions. There is a clarity now, a capacity to discern that was forged through experience rather than taught through theory. It is not a comfortable power, but it is a real one. The question, however, is how it will be used. Because awareness without balance can become isolation. Perception without trust can become paranoia. And strength, if driven solely by past pain, can quietly turn into rigidity. So understand this. Becoming sharper is not the same as becoming whole. True transformation lies not just in seeing more, my braver, but in knowing when to soften again, because a mind that only protects itself will never fully experience the life it fought so hard to survive. And so, after enduring the invisible war, witnessing the death of who they once were, shutting down their emotions, and reconstructing their awareness, they emerge as something entirely unrecognizable, not to the world, and sometimes not even to themselves. Survival has a way of reshaping a person, carving out new contours in the psyche that were never there before. They are stronger, sharper, and wiser. But these gains do not come without a cost. Every adaptation, every defense mechanism, every hard-won insight carries with it a hadao, a weight that cannot simply be shed. What is remarkable, and often misunderstood, is that this transformation is both triumph and loss. They have acquired clarity, resilience, and insight that others rarely achieve. They can read people, anticipate deception, and navigate life with a vigilance born from experience. Yet, in acquiring these abilities, they have also lost the ease of their former self, the spontaneous trust, the unguarded joy, the vulnerability that once made connection simple. Survival demanded it, and survival demanded change. And here lies the paradox. The very pain that sought to destroy them has also elevated them. But what is gained in strength is tempered by distance. What is sharpened in awareness is softened in warmth. They can endure, they can defend, they can strategize, but intimacy and innocence have been reshaped, perhaps permanently. They are no longer who they were, and the person they have become walks a line between power and isolation, insight and detachment, wisdom and caution. This is the price of becoming unrecognizable. It is not a punishment. It is a consequence of having been forced to adapt at the deepest levels of mind and spirit. And it asks a profound question of anyone who survives such trials. When you rebuild yourself from fragments, do you consciously choose who you will be? Or do you merely accept what the pain has made inevitable? So remember this: survival changes everything, but it does not define the end. You are not merely a product of what you endured. You are the architect of what comes next. And the challenge is clear. Do not just survive. Learn, reclaim, transform consciously, so that what emerges is not just unrecognizable, but fully, profoundly your own.